From Matt Hughes and Frank Trigg's welterweight chaos, to Robbie Lawler and Rory McDonald's bloody affair, here are some of the best UFC rematches of all time. Starting with Matt Hughes and Frank Trigg's second outing. This was one chaotic fight. Trigg had a second shot at grappling the UFC gold, and he looked optimistic. All he wanted was to somehow win that belt, and he showed that by the way he fought. Right off the bat, Trigg landed a knee in the guts and had Hughes under his control. Although that move was illegal, the ref never saw it, and neither did Hughes. Trigg pounced on that opportunity and almost had him in the perfect position to hold in a rear naked choke. It seemed like Hughes would give up. But then, out of nowhere, he got up. It was insane. Then, Matt picked Trigg over his shoulders and ran the whole distance of the octagon and slammed his opponent into the ground. Hit him with a few elbows for good measure, and then held him in a rear naked choke of his own. And that was it. Trigg was out cold. It was one of the craziest fights ever. But it wasn't the only time Matt was involved in a memorable rematch. Cause who can forget about Georges St-Pierre versus Matt Hughes too? When these two fought for the first time, Georges clearly wasn't ready to become a champion. But in the second fight against Hughes, he was a different beast. At UFC 65 in 2006, Pierre proved why he deserved to become one of the best fighters in the welterweight division. Matt Hughes was arguably the best welterweight ever at that time. And when the best is dethroned, it only means one thing: that there's a new king in town. And on that night in California, a new king was most definitely crowned. Like, Georges completely dominated that fight. Hughes just couldn't keep up with his quick feet and quick hands. It was just an outrageous display by Pierre. In the second round, Georges landed a sweet left kick right to his opponent's head, and it was over for Hughes. He fell down, and Georges ended the fight with a few well-placed blows to the face. Truly the beginning of a new era in MMA. However, the next rematch on my list was the end of a legendary winning streak. Quinton Jackson versus Chuck Liddell 2. We never noticed this at the time, but that fight marked the end of an era. It marked the end of Chuck Liddell's sensational light heavyweight championship run. Jackson won the first outing between the two in 2003, but people never rated Jackson higher than Liddell. They said the version of Liddell that Jackson defeated was nowhere near his best version. So, Jackson got the opportunity to prove everyone wrong in 2007. It was indeed Liddell's strongest ever version, like he was on a 7-fight winning streak. And guess what? Jackson knocked him out in the first round of the fight after some crazy blows to his face. That night belonged to only one man, and his name was Quinton Jackson. Speaking of proving people wrong, who can forget the way Brandon Moreno redeemed himself against Davison Figueiredo? This one was a blockbuster. Moreno was released by the UFC in 2018 and started fighting for the Legacy Fighting Alliance in 2019. The only thing he wanted, though, was to come back to the UFC, and his impressive time at the Legacy Fighting Alliance helped him in coming back to the octagon. And what a comeback it was! He won 3 straight fights upon his return to the octagon. And then it was his time to fight Figueiredo once again. People thought it would be a close encounter just like the last one. But it wasn't. Moreno was something else this time around. He completely outskilled Figueiredo and won that fight via submission. Figueiredo had no idea what hit him. On that night, Moreno became a UFC champion and the greatest Mexican fighter in UFC history. A total blockbuster. Speaking of which, the next fight was nothing short of one either. Nate Diaz versus Conor McGregor 2. Diaz was actually a sudden replacement to fight McGregor at UFC 196. No one thought that a rematch between the two would create so much hype. But what happened next was incredible. Their rematch at UFC 202 was so hyped that it became the second best-selling pay-per-view in UFC history. And the good thing is that it lived up to its hype as well. It was one wild fight between the two. Diaz was all over the ground as Conor knocked him down several times. He did just enough to keep Diaz at bay and went home with a decision win. It was a huge win for him. The rivalry is still tied at 1 apiece between the two. Just imagine what a third fight between the two can do. But even if it doesn't happen, at least we got to see both men walk away with the W once. The same can't be said about this next one though. Frankie Edgar versus Gray Maynard 2. Despite the fact that the fight ended in a draw, I absolutely need to talk about Edgar's performance in the rematch. He was on top of the world in that fight. Maynard started the fight brilliantly. The first round was all about him. There was no stopping him in that round. But the fight turned on its head in the second one. Frankie showed us some amazing survival skills in the next round. But that's not it. Even after being way behind in the scorecards, Edgar came so close to winning that fight. It was an unforgettable performance by the man. Truly one of the most amazing rivalries in UFC history. Just like this next one, Dustin Poirier versus Max Holloway. Their second outing isn't just of the best rematches of all time, it's easily one of the greatest lightweight fights of all time. 7 years after fighting each other for the first time, the two met again in 2019. This was a fight that took a lot out of them, and a couple of months off their careers too. They just went after each other with full force. Holloway dominated the UFC for 5 straight years. He was easily the best striker in the promotion. But that was a night when Max was brutalized by Poirier. Both fighters showed great composure and a heart of a lion in that fight. And after 5 breathtaking rounds, Poirier won the fight via decision. It was after this fight that Poirier was actually recognized as a legitimate talent in the UFC. And the next fight I'm going to talk about had a similar effect on Robbie Lawler. His second match against Rory MacDonald has to be up there with one of the greatest fights of all time. While Poirier versus Holloway took a couple of months off each other's careers, this one must have taken off years. It was one of those where you could only see blood. It was ruthless and ultra-violent. It's not a surprise that these two weren't the same fighters after this battle ever again. There were punches thrown all over and kicks flying everywhere. I mean, just look at their records after the fight. The two have a combined record of 6-9-1. This is how much one fight can take out of you. After 4 brutal rounds, Robbie finished the fight in the first minute of the last round. Rory was already struggling to stay on his feet after taking so many hits. All it took was one final blow from Robbie to finish off a stunning fight. It was a proper war. And that's all for the best UFC rematches of all time.